if you look at the expanse of Alaska history, there have been some momentous events. One was the Treaty of Cession. The next big one was the Statehood Act. Then came the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And last was the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act. Our keynote speaker this morning is going to talk about the role of education in the movement to resolve land claims of the Alaska Natives. Emil Notti's earliest memories are of riding in a dog sled to go to his family's trapping cabin. His summers were spent at fish camp on rivers in interior Alaska. He attended the Eklutna and Mount Edgecombe boarding schools, then later graduated with a bachelor's degree in science and electrical engineering from the Northrop Institute of Technology in California. He's a Navy veteran. In his 30s, and think of how young that is, he invited a handful of Alaska Native leaders to a meeting to discuss land claims. 300 people showed up. That launched a lobbying effort that reached heights he and the other Alaska Native leaders would not have dreamed of as youth. Appearing on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, for instance, giving speeches to tens of thousands of people. And it was a nationwide lobbying effort, which was all undertaken standing united while under attack from nearly every interest group in Alaska: the Chamber of Commerce, sportsmen associations, the state of Alaska, and most Alaskans opposed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Their efforts included working with former Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. ANCSA, as we all know, was imperfect, but a major achievement nonetheless. We easily could have come away with a pittance and no land. Emil Notti today will talk.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Thank you for inviting me here to talk today. It's my distinct pleasure to talk to such a group of dedicated people who really are on the leading edge for change with our youth and everybody here. Of course, that would happen. I'll try to describe the situation that we faced when we started on a journey of land claims. Having a hard time getting it started. I'll describe events that led to the land claims, and education did play a big role in it. I'll describe obstacles, oppositions, education as we went through it. Education played a role. John Borbridge was one of the big leaders. He was a teacher and a coach. Willie Hensley was another one. He wrote a paper as a graduate paper about land claims and land rights in Alaska. Evan Hobson was from Barrow, and he was one of the kids that did not get selected to go to one of the boarding schools that was operating, but he was a strong leader. He was a captain in the National Guard, and he fought hard for his rights of his people. There were hundreds of people involved, and there are a lot of stories, and none of them are wrong. They might appear different, but there they are, the people's experience. So when you hear different stories, that was what they experienced. So I give them all the credit they have. One of the things was the older people stepped aside. In some of the regional meetings, they told their young people, we don't want to go before Congress, but you do your best. You take the lead on it. So although the older people's voices and concerns were heard, they were expressed by the younger people. Some people say, why did people, I've heard criticisms about people wearing suits and ties and going to these meetings, and there was a reason for it. It's uniform. The old history of Alaska is you could vote if you were civilized, if you gave up your dress, if you gave up your traditional dress. So what we did was a declaration. We are civilized. When we appeared before Congress, we represented people, so we did our best and dressed the way we had to. Now I get to land claims. Growth in Alaska is what's caused much of the conflict. But conflict has been the history of Alaska since the Russians came here. Since the Russians came here in 1841. Growth in Alaska has always been driven by events. The first was the miners in southeast Alaska. You felt that when the big fish trap companies moved in and displaced the families on the streams and extracted the resources to build a lot of wealth in Seattle. The next big growth was the miners and prospectors who traveled across Alaska. After miners came the war effort in the 40s, 41, 42 and all, when the military moved in and built their bases. They built air bases in Nome, Fairbanks, Northway, Cantwell, Anchorage, and then the Navy came in. Kodiak, Adak, Sitka. I have to keep up with my computer. But I said protests have always been part of the scene in Alaska. But the recent protests in the 50s and 60s came after the state started selecting land. And then came competition for land because the state was selecting land and selling it to run government. State had no tax base, no industry. So they had a right to select 103 million acres of land under the Statehood Act, and they didn't care where they got it. They were interfering with the lifestyle, and protests were coming. Homesteaders were big up north. That brought protests. People were crossing trap lines and taking over fish camps. That was causing protests, and nothing was happening. So regions started filing claims to the land, saying it's our land. And they filed claims of 110% of Alaska because some of the boundaries overlapped, and newspapers made a big thing about it. About that time, a man named Nick Gray showed up and started making the rounds up north. Nick was a personal valet to Ignatius Paderewski, who was an international pianist. So Nick traveled across the country as well as in Europe. He had a great command of the English language, and knew his way around society. And he came to Fairbanks and formed Fairbanks Native Association. Then he moved to Anchorage and formed Cook Inlet Native Association. And that's where I got interested. I was kind of fascinated with the way he handled himself, and he had how he described the problem. So we raised money and sent them to Bethel and Kodiak and Cordova, and he formed Native associations there. Besides all the protest, the catalyst really for us to move was Bob Bennett was in charge of Alaska in Juneau. They called him back to D.C. to make him commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. During the questioning, Chairman Scoop Jackson was from Washington State and said, for 200 years, America has spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the Indian problem. Bob Bennett was a Oneida Indian. And Scoop Jackson said, you're an Indian yourself. What will you do different to solve the problem? Bob Bennett started to answer, and Scoop Jackson stopped him and said, I don't want an off-the-cuff answer. Come back in 90 days with a written report. That was January 1966. That 90-day report came out in April. I read the portion on it about Alaska, and it said, the Bureau of Indian Affairs is going to draw up a final solution to the land problem in Alaska. And I knew nothing about land problems or lobbying or Indian law or anything else, but I thought, if we have any rights in land, we should have something to say about it. But I didn't know what to do with it. So I sat on it from April until in July. I wrote a letter to 14 people. Some I knew, some I didn't know, from around the state, and said, we should meet to try to get involved. We set the date for October 18th, and that's kind of a significant date. It was 99 years after the Russian flag came down, the American flag went up right here in Sitka. But it was also an election year, and October was 1 month before the election. The governor was up, congressmen were up, so it was a good time to have a gathering. It cost tens of thousands of dollars to travel to villages to campaign. So here we had 300 of the village leaders, mayors, tribal people in Anchorage. The politicians were delighted to buy lunch and dinner for 3 days to anybody who wanted to show up. So it worked out well because the delegates who came to town came at their own expense, and the politicians were happy to provide the meals. So we finally organized in April of '67. AFN was broke. We had no money, no organization. We got first $100,000 from Tyonek Village. They loaned it. A couple years later, the Yakima tribe in eastern Washington loaned $250,000 with no guarantee that they'd ever get the money back. But they were doing their part to help out. Of course, banks wouldn't wouldn't touch us. We had no assets, no history. In 1966 also, because of all the protests, Secretary Udall imposed a land freeze in Alaska. He stopped state of Alaska selecting 103 million acres of land. He stopped homesteaders. It became a problem for everybody. and we did our best to keep it from being lifted, because if it was a problem for everybody, it had a better chance. If it was just the Indian problem, we'd still be fighting it. But when we stopped Alaska and homesteaders, everybody got involved to solve this problem. Can you imagine us drafting legislation with a board of directors of 25 people, 12 regional lawyers, and drafting a complicated bill by committee? We did that for a couple of years, and I chaired most of those meetings. They were controversial and many arguments, and we broke up a couple of times and got back together, but we hung with the program. During all this, there was opposition to Klikit and Haida joining AFN. The argument was they have a settlement through the lawsuit, and we had an argument. We argued one day. It practically took most of the day, and it really got mixed up when the attorneys started arguing. They were all representing their groups, their clients, and clients all had different wants, and even had an attorney make a motion, and I had to tell him he couldn't make a motion, and he said he was doing it for his clients, and I said, well, your clients can make the motion. He didn't, so I cut him off, but finally I cleared the room of everybody, observers and lawyers especially, that really protested, and they said, we'll decide this among ourselves. So we argued that admitting T&H into AFN. I put it to a vote. It was a tie vote, 12 to 12. I cast the tie-breaking vote to admit them because I didn't think $7 million for 18 million acres of land was a settlement, and no land to go with it. That small amount of money for the amount of the resources that were being transferred. There was a lot There was a lot happening besides land claims. We were being called on because Alaska was a different place, and the villagers were having a lot of trouble. So one day, I got a call that said, you have to go to Bethel. I didn't know why. There was just trouble out in Bethel. So I got on a morning plane, and on the way out, a state trooper in full uniform came and sat by me. He was a nice guy. I knew him, and he came from a good family in Wasilla, but he said, why are you going to Bethel? And I said, well, I'm not sure. There's something going on out there. I was curious why he was going. He didn't know. He said that the governor's office called him and told him to get out there. So when we landed, we found a senator from Big Lake was on a local radio saying, sell your fish to the Japanese if they offer you a good price. The rumor was that if they sold their fish to the Japanese, they would go to jail. And they were really scared. And I went down to the beach, and they were throwing king salmon ashore. And there was a buyer saying, small, medium, small, medium. I saw some pretty big kings go by and never heard large. So I got on a little plane on floats and flew down the river to the fish camps. And you could see the Japanese freezer ship out there. So I'd climbed the riverbank and in the fish camp, and typical fish camp, kids are running around, a couple of dogs running around, a couple of smudge fires to keep the mosquitoes away, and parents and grandparents. So I would tell them it's not illegal to sell to the Japanese. If they give you a good price, sell. You're not going to go to jail. And even as late as it was at that time, the parents had to translate to the grandparents what I was saying. So I got back to Bethel, and I took an late afternoon flight back to Anchorage. And 10 o'clock at the same night, I was on a plane going to Juneau because I had a 7 o'clock meeting with the governor next morning. On the way down, his attorney was sitting by me. I didn't know it at the time, but I knew he represented a group. He wasn't AFN attorney, we didn't have one, but he represented a group, and I didn't know he was also a personal friend of Hickel, and Hickel had been his client at some point. But we're going down there to try to convince Hickel to support 40 million acres of land. And we're talking about it, and I said, after we're finished with that, I'm going to bring up the fish thing in Bethel. And he said, oh, I wouldn't do that. He knew something I didn't know. But anyway, I brought it up. So next morning, we're about 6 of us in the room, and Hickel walked in. And he slammed that door, and the doors are big, 8-foot heavy doors, and the walls shook, and he sat down. Literally, he was pounding the table. He was really upset. And he had bought, it takes a couple of years to build a ferry boat. The state of Alaska needed a ferry, so he bought a Norwegian tour boat, renamed it the Wickersham. And he found out he couldn't use it between Seattle and Alaska because the Maritime Act, 1934, forbid foreign boats from moving between American ports. So he had to run it out of Vancouver. And he was saying, you guys are always coming down here and asking me for help. Why don't you help me once in a while? Pick up the phone. You have a Democratic president, who was Johnson. You have Democratic senators, Greening and Bartlett. Pick up a phone and help me. Get rid of the Jones Act. And, of course, it's still in effect. It can't. So we talked about 40 million acres, and he said, I'll support it. And then he turned to me and said, what in heck were you doing in Bethel, taking the governor's office on? And I said, well, Governor, I was out there because fish buyers are buying fish in a round. State law calls for buying by the pound. And so he said, you're right, but I corrected that. They're buying fish by the pound. So from 10 o'clock previous night till 7 o'clock that morning, he said he had a meeting with the buyers, and they're now buying fish by the pound. Good. I won't comment on that. Alaska, before Congress, Alaska Native claims were not important. We would fly down to D.C. and show up at 10 o'clock in the morning to testify, and they'd say, come back tomorrow. America, they had some big problems. Vietnam War was the biggest. Rioting in the streets. Kids were shot on campus. So we weren't important. So I got an invitation to go to Northwest Federated Tribes in Washington State. So I went down there just after 2 years. And on the way down, I was thinking, I can't just say we're testifying to Congress and who cares? I had to say something to get their attention. So I made a speech about a separate nation. And I said the United States spent billions of dollars creating the nation of Israel for people who had no country. How can you do less for people who lost all the North American continent? If Congress can't settle on 40 million acres, I would recommend we go to the United Nations and World Court and ask for establish a country for Native people. Anyone of Native extraction could be a citizen. What I wanted to do is other senators say, what's this about a separate country? I don't know if it had any effect, but it did in Alaska. I got personal editorial out of Anchorage Times. Senator got up on the floor and Juneau called me a communist. They get name called when there's nothing else to do. So Nixon was elected in the meantime, and we knew he was considering Hickel to be Secretary of Interior. And Hickel had filed a lawsuit as governor to lift the land freeze. It was illegal, breaking a statehood act, and he was really against it. Native had no rights. We have no legal claim. And so Hickel was coming back from Washington, D.C. after an interview with Nixon. And a newspaper reporter asked them, what are you going to do about the land freeze? And Hickel said, what you all can do with the stroke of a pen, I can undo. So he had our attention. A couple of days later, I got a call from an attorney and said, Secretary of Interior wants to talk to you. It took me a second to realize he meant Hickel, so I said, I don't know where he lives. So he picked me up. We went to Hickel's home, and when we walked in, Hickel was holding a syndicated column by Walter Winchell, that was going to be published in the morning paper. And Hickel said, do you talk to outside Indians? I said, yes. Can you get me an endorsement? I said, probably. Will AFN endorse me? And I said, I'll call a meeting and see if we can do that. But I said, before I do that, I need a public statement from you that you won't lift the land freeze. He said, well, we won't do anything to hurt you. So we talked for a while and left. The attorney was livid when we got in the car. He said, you called the governor a liar. I said, no, I don't think I did. Well, you did. You didn't believe him when he said he wouldn't hurt Native people. I said, if we endorsed him and he lifted the land freeze, what would I say? You promised not to? Here's the Secretary of Interior and the governor, and I'm saying you promised. It wouldn't mean a thing. I need something more than that. So he said, well, you insulted the governor. It's a mistake. You have to deal with him. As governor, if he doesn't make it, you have to deal with him as Secretary of Interior if he does make it. I can't work with you anymore. So he said I quit. Well, he wasn't our attorney, so it didn't matter. So I called a board meeting, and when I got home, I started calling the board around the state, and I found out that same attorney was calling AFN Board of Directors and saying, you have to endorse Hickle. And I didn't know it, but I'd get a hold of a board member and say, you have to come to a special meeting. And I said, well, I told this attorney I'd endorse, and I said, no, don't do it. Our strength is in unity. So 10 o'clock at night, the newspaper called me and said, are you going to endorse Hickle? And I said, oh, I'm calling a meeting about it. And he said, well, I'm talking. He didn't say he was talking. He said, I'm hearing that the board of directors will endorse them. And I said, are you talking? Who have you talked to? He said, nobody. And I said, well, before you quote anybody, you better talk to them. So he didn't run the story. So when we got to the meeting, the board, the unanimous vote said pick 3 people and go to D.C. for Hickle's nominating hearing. So I picked John Borbridge, Willie Hensley, and Evan Hobson. We went down 3 days early, and we talked to all the committee members in the Senate, telling them we needed to hold a land freeze. Then we got to the hearings. We'd get there early because it was Hickle's nomination was a very hot item. All the big environmental groups in America opposed him because he was the developer. So we'd get in and get the first row, and the room was always full. After the first 2 days, third day we got there, and the first rows were blocked off. So we sat in the 4th row. And when the committee came in, Senator Stevens, who had been appointed to the Senate seat when Bob Bartlett died, said, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce these, the door opened, all these Alaskans came in. He said, I'd like to introduce these outstanding Alaskans who came down to support our governor to be Secretary of Interior. And these people were, they were who's who in Alaska, editors, bankers, business people, unions. So he said, I'd like them to stand up. So they stood up. And the 4 of us were sitting down behind them. They'd turn around and say, what's the matter with you guys? Stand up. So we didn't stand. When we didn't endorse them at that point. After 2 days of hearings, Hickle, the FBI knew everything about Hickle. When we'd go into to lobby a senator, they'd ask us about, what do you know about his gas line to Anchorage? What do you know about his hotel financing? What do you know about? We said, we don't know anything about his business. We're here to hold the land freeze. So for 2 days, that land freeze came up. Scoop Jackson was in favor of the land freeze, and he said, we want the corpus intact, so to speak, so we can divide up, have something to divide up if we pass the land claims. So Hickle would give an answer and never promised. The 3rd day, Scoop Jackson walked in. He's still standing. He picked up his microphone, come to order. He said, Governor, we've been dealing with an issue for the last 2 days, and I thought we put it to rest. But after reading the record last night, I'm not too sure. Will you come before this committee before you dispose of any federal lands? And I thought, this is an up or down question. If he doesn't promise to do that, he won't get nominated. or voted on. He hesitated a minute and said, yes. He gave up the power of the Secretary of Interior to the committee, congressional committee, in order to get the nomination. So after that, I went forward and said, we endorse Hickel for Secretary of Interior. He'd make a great secretary. So, but I mentioned we did not have an attorney our own. So we got Arthur Goldberg, Supreme Court Justice, former, and former Attorney General Ramsey Clark. Congress did not pay much attention to the local attorneys. They were all good attorneys, and they were new law and everything, but they weren't known in D.C., so they weren't given much weight. When I first time I went forward, had Arthur Goldberg here, Ramsey Clark here, and Arthur Goldberg's statement was, gentlemen, this is the final chance for the United States government to deal fairly with the Native people in America. And he became our lead attorney and did not take pay for the job. A legal question came up. Ramsey Clark answered it and said, that's my recollection of the law. If you'd like, I'll brief the question to you. And Scoop Jackson said, who was an attorney himself and dealt with a lot of Indian problems, said, General, if that's your recollection of the law, I accept it. They gave us a whole new standing before Congress. They listened to what we had to say and what we were talking about. So there was a lot of controversy in getting a lead attorney because everybody else tried to be the lead attorney. We had a lot of opposition. Every newspaper in Alaska had editorials against land claims. In over the 4 or 5 years, they had many editorials about it. The Miners Association opposed us. Sportsmen were the worst group. They wanted to go anywhere and everywhere and fish and do all the hunting they wanted. They opposed us very strongly. Chamber of Commerce opposed us. Every city has their Chamber of Commerce, but when it goes statewide, at the annual meeting, the executive director had on a big top hat and he had an arrow through it. And he mocked us. What do the Native people think they're doing? What are they asking for? They have no rights. And they had a good laugh about it, but today they'll deny that they ever did that because they need the membership of the corporations. We did have support. A few churches donated money, $1,000 here and there, and we had people testify for us in hearings in Anchorage. And then one day, Senator Sackett from up on the Yukon elbowed me and he said, Emil, watch out. There's a contract out on you. And I said, yeah. I ignored it. A couple days later, somebody else elbowed me and said, be careful, there's a contract out on you. So I called the Attorney General. I said, what do you know about a contract on me? He said, I know nothing, but stay right where you are. I'll call you back. 15 minutes later, head of state troopers called me. He said, what you've been hearing is true. What you don't know is that we're with you 24 hours a day. We're outside of your home. We follow your kids to school on the bus. We follow them home. We watch them go into your house. We go to lunch with you. We're with you 24 hours a day. They took it serious, and I did too for about 2 weeks. But too many things were happening. I forgot about it after a while. If they wanted to do it, they would have done it. But not having money, we didn't have a real strong, disciplined organization. We didn't have money to say, go here and this is what you say, and go over here and testify and lobby and all. We had groups all dedicated, and they were meeting with anybody and everybody to explain what we were doing. We had people on Good Morning America, Johnny Carson show. Burbridge and I were on a talk show in Philadelphia. We got a big, powerful endorsement from AFL-CIO union. And then the biggest group, I got invited to Detroit to talk to the American Association of Churches. And I got there a day early, and in the lobby, this guy came up and we started talking, asked me what I was doing, and we had dinner, and I didn't know who he was. Next morning, I go to make a pitch to the delegates for endorsement. And before I got started, there's 12 bishops on the head table, podium, and half a dozen young people came in yelling and screaming, and they went along the head table pouring red paint on the papers from these bishops who sat there with their arms folded, didn't say a thing. The young people went out the door, and the bishops didn't raise a voice. They didn't call security. They just kept going with the meeting. So I addressed the preachers and asked them to endorse our bill. 10,000 preachers were out there. And when I did that, somebody in the back of the room got the microphone and said, before we endorse anything, we should know what's in the bill. And the man that I had dinner with, who I didn't know it, but he was secretary to the International Council of Churches. And he stood up and got the microphone and said, what do we care what's in the bill? If the Native people in Alaska like it, we should support it. So they endorsed our bill. And the plan was that they say they talked to 40 million Americans every Sunday morning, and they were to write their state representatives and endorse our bill. So we got a lot of push there, I think. So we did everything we could do with what we had. So 5 years later, in December 1971, Nixon signed the land claims bill. We started with nothing, no experience, did something never been done before. Most settlements came through treaties, not through Congress. We had no organization, no money. We had the bill signed. Canada was different. Canada funded the Native people, their First Nations. They hired lawyers and anthropologists. They built a real case for what they were doing. Canada was much more progressive. They formed a separate nation, Nunavut. They not only made them self-governing, they gave them exclusive hunting rights beyond their borders. Here in Alaska, we have people who can't get work in the villages and can't make a life on subsistence. So Canada dealt much more humanely with their problem than America did. When Nixon signed that bill, he changed the history of Alaska forever. It's been good for Alaska. They have good-paying jobs. Most or many non-natives have good-paying jobs as managers. A lot of people work for the corporations. You have big office buildings that pay taxes to the cities. It's benefiting the state of Alaska a lot. These corporations have contracts from around the world. They're bringing money back into Alaska. It was not a negotiated settlement. It was not give or take. We proposed a bill, and Congress modified it. We lost some big issues, but not being negotiated and having done it with a lot of volunteer help work, it was something that nobody gave us much of a chance having success at. So thank you.